This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. Thanks for joining us for another show, and we welcome you and your viewpoints. So keep in mind that you can always interact with me also by sending an email to my story at onehumannation.info. Remember, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. As some of you may know, I've recently moved back to Savannah after living in Texas for over 30 years. And I keep saying recently moved back to Savannah. So let's say November 2016 was my official move date back into Savannah. So I've been acclimating to the Savannah culture as it relates to race and reconciliation. And it's totally different from the culture that I left in Austin, Texas. So as we continue to move forward, or as I should say, as I continue to move forward in learning more about the Savannah culture, I connect with people that are actually from Savannah. I mean, because that's the best way to find out about Savannah culture. Besides observing and attending different events, it's also about connecting with different people. So the guests today is actually someone that I connected with that's willing to share his story. He lives in Savannah. Well, he actually works in Savannah. I'm not sure if he lives in Savannah proper. And he's willing to share his viewpoints on how he moved through the journey of reconciliation and getting to where he is now on this journey. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that we try to emphasize on the One Human Nation show that this is a place that you can have a safe, honest, open, and productive dialogue. And one of the ways that we try to be productive is we establish a framework for how we're going to have conversations, how we're going to engage in conversations, so that no one feels like they're being judged, because it truly is your individual journey. And wherever you are on that journey, you're welcome to share your story on the One Human Nation show. So what I've done in trying to really convey some of the concepts, I've did a little tweak to the website for onehumannation.info. And to make it easier, number one, for you to listen to shows that have already aired. So if you go to onehumannation.info, right on the homepage, it has listen to shows. So all of the shows that have been aired, as I edit and update them, they're posted here. You can also find the shows posted on www.wruu.org, but there's a couple of more clicks you have to get to. And I know how we don't like to click through. So this is a way for you to easily access previous shows as they're edited and updated to the One Human Nation website. In addition to updating the homepage so that it makes it easier for you to access information, I've also updated the resources page for onehumannation.info. And so if you click on resources, you'll now see the title Undoing Racism, because that's what this is all about. How do we go through the process of undoing racism? And to me, it starts with defining racism. And you will see that definition that I particularly like as far as how we define racism. I wish I can say it was my idea, but it's not. So I'm giving credit to David Wellman in the book that he wrote, Portrait of Racism. And he defines racism very simply as a system of advantage based on race. A system of advantage based on race. So one of the recommended readings that I now have posted right under this is a book that I'm really fascinated with and been reading through and digesting by psychologist Beverly Daniel Tatum, PhD, and it's entitled, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she actually published this book in 1999, but it's so relevant in how we can go through a journey of reconciliation. So here are some of the chapters that, and I'll let you go through and read the book in more detail, but I just wanted to give you a sneak preview because it's not what you were thinking if you just heard the title. The first chapter is a definition of terms. And when she talks about a definition of terms, not only is she talking about how we define racism, she gets into a lot more detail so we can talk about it. And the second chapter is understanding blackness in a white context. The third chapter, you guessed it, understanding whiteness in a white context. And the fourth chapter is beyond black and white. And the fifth chapter is breaking the silence. So one of the things that I like about her book is she does give some tools because, we like to have something to figure out, okay, well, what do I need to do? And where am I now? And how can I figure this out? Or how can I get better? Or how can we get to the point of being one human nation? Is there a book that we can read? Or is there a test we can take? And there's not one thing. It's a combination of things for you to be curious about. And one of the things that we do stress is it's about your internal journey. It's not for me or anyone else to say, this is where we think you are, and this is what you need to do. And if you do A plus B, you will be at C by such and such date. It doesn't work that way. And we have been programmed in our society that we want, we want performance measures. We want to know, well, what are our objectives and what's the goal? And the goal is to be one human nation. But to get to that point, we have to go through a very painful process of reconciliation to get to healing, to get to justice. And you probably will get sick of me saying that, but there is no shortcut. It is a process of getting through reconciliation and healing, and your journey is your journey. And sometimes we want to stop that journey. And I will say even I was resistant to even thinking about reconciliation because, frankly, I thought as a person of color, it's like, why in the world would I start going to a workshop about race reconciliation with the majority of people there being white? Why would I put myself through that? And that's what reconciliation is all about. The process is, it can be painful. It gets us out of our comfort zone. So I have a friend of mine, and when she used the phrase this way, I really thought it was symbolic of what needs to happen. And she said, Sandy, no matter what side of the fence we are on, whether we are white or a person of color, we all have to go through reconciliation and go through healing in order to get to justice. And it can be very painful. So there are times that you may need to go through this process with a group that looks just like you, because there are things you want to talk about, you want to get out of your system, and it may not be appropriate to have another group there as you're going through this. So in Austin, I know there were different groups that individuals, they may have a reading group, or when they invite people over to dinner at their house, some of them actually use some of the video clips from the PBS series Race, the Power of an Illusion. There is no right or wrong. The question is, well, where do you start? What do you do? And of course, I always encourage you to be curious and explore the culture in your community. And that's what I'm doing in Savannah, is exploring the culture. And I know other cities have, really, and different communities have really taken on a very proactive stance on anti-racism, and that is awesome. I know there's a group that's in Texas that, they refer to it as courageous conversations. And how do you go through that process of having courageous conversations about something we really don't want to talk about? We want to forget about it. And as a reminder today, just I'm reminding myself also, we will have a guest that will be calling in about 4 or 5 minutes now, and talking about their journey and moving through reconciliation. And it's a little interesting for me to talk to this person because it's somebody that I met in Savannah, so I don't really know them that well. So it'll be interesting to see how we work through this conversation. And of course, we've already talked, not being on the radio, but it's always interesting to see how this conversation is going to work out in Savannah. So one of the things I will encourage you to do, and I will continuously encourage you to do, is to really look at the resources posted, and especially the graphic of the iceberg culture. And it shows what we look at on the surface, things like language and food and performances and arts and crafts, dances, music. And what's really important is what's underneath the iceberg, because that's the deep culture, that's the subculture, and a lot of times you don't even know what that culture is, and that's why it's important to be curious, to start asking yourself the question, what kind of environment did I participate in, or was I exposed to growing up? Did we even have conversations about race? Did we talk about people in terms of others? And how did that translate as you got older, or at what point in time did you start realizing that there was and is such a thing as race? And remember, the definition that I definitely like is having race described or defined as a system of advantage based on race. And what I've found to be the case, and I talked to the guest that's going to be calling in about this, is when I've talked to white people that have gone through the One Human Race series, one of the things that they've shared is they feel really guilty and ashamed of the whole slavery context, and that's bad enough. And then on top of that, to try to reconcile with, they didn't have a choice on what color their skin was. So why should they, in some ways, even have to deal with going through reconciliation? I mean, at what cost do they need to, and how has it impacted them if they don't, or if they do? And how do they move past the shame and the guilt that's attached to that? Now, there is a flip side of the fence, because if you're a person of color, and I'll speak for myself as an African American, I had to work through and still work through issues of, whether I have anger about it, whether I have sadness about it, just the overall, just sadness about what my ancestors were exposed to. And then, how to get my head around where we are currently in this country, and how racism has gotten to be so ingrained in our systems, in our institutions. And how do we get our head around that? How do we move forward in becoming one human nation? So I realize it's not an easy conversation. And one of the things that we do say to the participants going through the One Human Race series is that, you may have an emotional response to what you're hearing or experiencing. And the phrase that someone designed or came up with, part of this group, was that the divine is found in the tension. So unfortunately, we do have to be exposed to the discomfort in order for us to really get in touch with what's going inside of us. What are we continuously moving forward generation to generation, and how do we stop the cycle? Because we do realize that it's not an easy cycle to stop, but it's one that we all have to get on board in order for us to move towards becoming one human nation. So it looks like we're coming up to when the guests will be calling into the show. So I'm going to take a break now and let you listen to some of the smooth sounds of Mr. Joe Morales.
I can still hear you. Got it? Fabulous. Sandy, it is. Thanks. No, we're good to go. I was listening to the show and got a good idea about what we're going to chat about.
If you had any stories about race, others, racism, kind of just get us started with just in general how your world was shaped in your early years.
Sure. Well, the first 15 years of my life I spent in Chicago, and for anyone who doesn't know, even back then, Chicago was an extremely segregated community, not just by race, but also by ethnicity. It's kind of famous for its different neighborhoods, whether it's Italians or Lithuanians or Greeks or Mexicans or African Americans. And so in growing up in that type of a city, you became early aware that there were certain places where people would congregate and live and shop and work, where folks in those areas were all very similar to one another. And so add to that fact that I was 10-year-old during the height of the civil rights movement, and in Chicago that played out in a very, very public way, especially in 66, 67, 68, 69, very close to my neighborhood. I lived very close to Marquette Park, which was the scene of Nazi demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, and so you couldn't possibly live there and not be aware of the fact that these were issues that were being discussed and fought about. So,
from Chicago, where did you move after that?
When I was 16, my mom remarried, and we moved to a town in rural Virginia. That was an interesting place because it's in the mountains there, and you were in a community where there was very little wealth from anybody.
Right.
And so it was, and I think when we discussed it, it was a place where the demographics of the place were somewhat mirrored what the country is. It was about 12 or 13% African American. We had a small Hispanic population, and then the rest was mostly Caucasian. And so I told somebody once that it seemed like in that town everybody was too poor to be concerned with anybody being any different.
Well, yeah, there is some truth on the economics of being poor. Kind of erasing that dividing line with race. And it's, I think, truthfully, especially in a smaller city. And so from there, kind of share what was your next phase on your journey?
Well, it ended up going to college and law school, and then working for a while in Western Virginia, but eventually gravitating to here in Savannah. And some of the reason I chose living in Savannah was because of the amazing diversity of the city. And so it's been an educational process, with the different places, but also during that transition period coming here, my brother met and fell in love with his wife, who's Dominican, and so our family became multi-ethnic, multicultural, and in that sense, I think that was a transition too.
So share with me and the listeners as far as when your family kind of took a shift and taking a look to be more biracial as you started having, is it nieces or nephews?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
both.
You both. So how was that for you when you would go out in public with them? What was that experience like for you?
I think that this is more, relatively recently. So it's a little different world, I
Mm-hmm.
think, than it was back in Chicago when I was a kid. But it certainly you become aware of the fact that you might get a different glance or look from somebody. Who is that person that he's with? Or you go to the pool and say, introduce someone as, this is my niece or this is my nephew,
Mm-hmm.
and occasionally you get a little strange reaction to it. For the most part, people are pretty cool, but I think if you ask them, they're dealing with that type of issue is probably a little more intense.
Right. So, and this may or may not have happened yet, because you're saying that this is something that's happening more, recent, kind of in your journey here, going through this process with them. Have they asked you questions about, why are people looking at us, or why they're asking us these questions, or why are we getting, or have they, what ages are they? Have they even put it into that context? Because I'm fascinated with the book that I'm reading now, and it starts talking about identity and when kids start identifying, and how adults can help them through that process. So have you had any of that going on as part of your experiences with your niece and nephew?
Yeah. In fact, I think really, my oldest niece is the best example, because she ended up going to Savannah State. And she chose going to Savannah State because it was an HBCU,
Mm-hmm.
and I think having her uncle there didn't hurt, but it was also a standpoint of wanting to make sure that she was to that part of her culture, and she's also very proud of her Dominican heritage.
Right.
And so we've certainly had conversations about all of that. But by the same token, she would be around campus and say, introduce me to people, and say, this is my uncle. And, she didn't expect anybody to react in an odd way. Certainly, occasionally they did, but that was not what she was going to expect or tolerate, for that matter. And so, you've got to be able to just accept the definition of family, regardless of what other people want to impose on it.
Right. And Joe, I know one of the things I had mentioned to you, that in doing the race reconciliation workshops, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning of the show, one of the emotions that white people would express to me over and over again as they were waking up and really learning the history, it was just this overwhelming set of emotions around guilt and shame. And we would have, it's not unusual to have people attending these workshops to actually be very emotional, and they may cry. And from my standpoint, it's like, that's part of the history, and we just have to move through that. But that's not really an answer. How did you make the shift from going through, being a white male? You went to, I think it was Wake Forest that you went to.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And so,
Yep.
I mean, you can't get more elitist than that.
No.
So how did you, and we're going to get back to Wake Forest in a minute, but how did you get to this point of shifting through that? Because
I think guilt is a place that is maybe a natural place to go, but I think in going through the journey, I've certainly found that it's not a useful place to go. And part of it's because I studied history in school. Being a history major, I can look back at any of my ancestors, whether there's some that from Poland or from Ireland or from wherever, and they were either on the doling out end or the receiving end of horrible things, if you look back far enough. And so, to own guilt about something based on your ancestry is not particularly helpful. I think what is helpful, though, is to realize that if there are things that are still going on that relate to discriminations or prejudices or abuse or enslavement or any of those things. And clearly I think there are, that it's not a sense of feeling guilty about it. It's a sense of feeling inspired by it, and to say, what is it that you're going to do in your personal life or journey to try to address those things?
Okay.
How are you going to create a situation that not only makes those things better, but how are you going to create a situation that reconciles those things? And so, to me, I look at it as inspirational rather than guilt producing.
Okay, and I think this is a good point for us, Joe, to take a little break so I can do some announcements. But if you can stay on the line, and we'll be back after a couple of messages, okay?
Absolutely.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Sentient Bean, offering fair trade coffee, vegan and vegetarian food, and breakfast all day. Located at 13 East Park Avenue, across the street from the tennis courts at Forsyth Park. Our menu and special events listings can be found at sentientbean.com.
WRUU is now collecting items for the annual Savannah Soundings fundraising auction. The auction will run from July 15th to July 30th, with proceeds going to WRUU to continue providing both great music and a voice for the Savannah community. Auction items range from gift cards to vouchers for products and services that are guaranteed to delight and surprise. Tell everyone you know about donating and about the auction. Donations can be made now. For information on donations, contact Trent Kissinger at takissinger@gmail.com. You're listening to WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. So, Joe, are you still there?
I am.
Okay, perfect. So you were talking about, how to, and of course, I'm going to tell you, Joe, you make it sound easy, okay? You make it sound like, oh, Sandy, people just need to get over it. They just need to move forward. They need to be, putting themselves in a positive place. But I think, in some ways I can understand it's more difficult, especially if they have family members that are still in this world that they have to intersect with on holidays. And, and on that note, I do want to get a little bit more insight for you. How did you manage going through Wake Forest? Because I know from our conversations you didn't consider yourself to be of the crowd that would typically go to Wake Forest as far as economically. So
no, and you're right. And if it sounded like I was expressing something that was easy, I don't mean to do that. I think to get to a place of positivity is an individual journey, and for a lot of people there is a lot of pain because of messages they heard, messages they were immersed in as children and as teenagers. And I remember the first time when I was at Wake Forest that I really felt odd, and that was we lived in suites where 8 people lived together. And one of the other guys there was from a rural town in North Carolina, and somehow we were talking about our ancestors and what our ethnicity was, and it turned out that it came out that I was Polish, and he said, "Oh, so you're a Polak?" And I was like, that's really one of the first times I heard that expression in a pejorative way. I'd heard jokes and things that were, not directed in a personal way. It's a stinging type of a feeling. It's a put down, and it's a put down based on something you have no control over. But the benefit that I had was I could walk out of that room, and that label didn't have to necessarily stick to me.
right.
But whereas if I walk out as a person of color, that label is obvious to everyone within that environment.
Right.
And so I think that it is a feeling that, although I can't feel it in the same way that a person of color does. I do understand at least where that emotion comes from, and from that standpoint, maybe it made it a little bit easier for me in the journey to say this is something worth trying to be proactive about, as opposed to sitting back and saying, "Oh my, what can I do?"
So is that what drove your direction as far as being an attorney, and specifically, choosing to have a career at an HBCU?
I think it has to play a part in it.
Okay.
I think more my faith does, in the sense that I honestly believe that if you have talents or gifts, that the greatest sin of all is not to use them. And so, but a question of is what you use them for. And yeah, I think there were certainly people in my extended family, if you will, that expressed racial or ethnic hostilities, and to be able to use the legal system, to be able to use what you did with your work, to fly in the face of it. Yeah, it's kind of cool in a lot of ways, right, to be the white attorney at Savannah State. I know it turns heads sometimes. I'll walk into a room. What do you do? Oh, I work at Savannah State. Really? Do you teach there? I said, no, I'm part of the administration. So, it's an interesting reaction you get sometimes.
Right. So, yeah, because I was wondering how that came to play. And, believe it or not, time is moving along. But I know just from talking to you, you had a couple of stories that I thought was interesting from that child perspective of some things
Mm-hmm.
that have happened with and I can't remember now whether it was with your niece when you attended a football game.
Yeah. My daughter, she was probably about 5, and brought one of her little friends to the Savannah State football game, and this particular kid his dad raised in rural Alabama, in a very privileged type of family. And so we were sitting there in the middle of the president's box, and he turned to me in a loud voice and said, "Joe, there sure are a lot of black people here." And, it was I wanted to laugh, but if you thought about it, it's really not that funny.
Right.
But my daughter turned to him and said, "What are you talking about?" And, I felt proud of her in the sense that it's not that she doesn't see the fact that people look different. She just makes no judgment based on it.
Right.
And so, from his perspective, somewhere along his early upbringing, because he's still a pretty young kid, someone had taught him that wasn't the normal situation.
Right.
And so, that isn't inherent. That's learned.
Exactly. And I think that's the part that makes this especially painful for those of us that are kind of, realizing that reconciliation is not easy, and how do we break the cycle from generation to generation, because it is, it is passed on, and, how do we offset that? Of course, I'm one of these people that I think we just have to get to a critical mass, to swing it in the other direction. I mean, that's why I love the format of the radio show, because, you can connect with so many more people. Whereas when we do the race reconciliation workshops, it's a smaller group, and it's intentionally done that way. But, as I think about that, I mean, do you have any thoughts that you want to share as far as, because you've been in Savannah for how long now?
Let me think, 18 years.
18 years. And so,
yeah,
I moved away from Savannah like in 1981, and fresh out of college from Mercer University. I mean, I, that was my last time really being in Savannah as a resident living here. So through all of my adult formative years, I was in Texas. So coming back to Savannah, it's very and of course I visited because I have, my family was here. So, but visiting is not the same as
No.
living here. So from your perspective, where do you see Savannah on the spectrum of working through reconciliation? I mean, if you had to, and I hate to do this, but we want that performance measure so bad. If you had to rate it on a scale from, and this is your perspective. So the good part about this show, it's no judgment, right?
Right.
So if you had to rate it on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being very ethnocentric, white dominant culture, very entrenched in racism, 1 being kind of like the worst part of the scale, and 5 being more ethno-relative as far as moving towards justice and what needs to be, in that part of the equation for diversity and inclusion. Because what's interesting for me in Savannah, so I'm going to keep talking while you digest on where you're going to rate the scale. What's interesting coming back to Savannah and seeing the demographics of realizing that there is a predominant African American culture, but numbers does not mean that you're the dominant culture. That's the thing that racism has done for this in this country. If I walk into a room and the room is, there are 10 people there and 8 of those people are African American and 2 of the people are white, the dominant culture typically still is the white culture. So if you had to, and if you don't want to even go to that scaling thing, it's kind of personally for me, just kind of my own curiosity as I continue to learn more about Savannah. Where would you put Savannah on the spectrum? Because, I definitely don't get the same vibe that I got when I lived in Texas. It appears to be that there is more of an ease, but that's my impression. Not to say that there's not racism, because we have the systemic problem, but how would you rate Savannah on a scale from 1 to 5?
Well, it to me, I like the scale, by the way, but I have to treat it as a bit schizophrenic, in the sense that I think from a cultural tolerance, how we see each other, how we go to events together, participate in camps together, we're doing pretty well. I think we're 4 out of 5. Okay. But when it comes to economic integration, when it comes to the real leverage of power in the community, we're much closer to 1, because the way that the economic wealth, the keys to financial success are distributed in this community, it's nowhere near close to what it is in places like Atlanta or Pittsburgh or wherever you might pick. It is still highly economically segregated. I'll give you a great example. I love to play golf, and so I'm a member of the Savannah Golf Club. And as such, it is an organization which is very much open to African Americans, to Hispanics, to Asians. And we have members from those ethnicities. But the vast majority of members are white. And the reason that they are, more than any other reason, is because the money
expensive.
in the city is in those hands.
Right.
And I can tell you that there's a handful of people there that are racist, but for the most part, most of them aren't. They just have money.
Right.
And so that's why I say it's a bit schizophrenic. Yes, we do see each other. We're not afraid of interacting with each other. We're not afraid of being exposed to one another's cultures, and that's good, from the standpoint of this city. my kids go to a public school and everybody's there.
Right.
And it's cool. It works out great. But if we go to an event at the golf club, it's not going to represent that same group.
Right. That's a good. I like that. I like that impression that you have about it, because I think in a lot of places it is schizophrenic. Although I won't continue to bash where I moved from, but believe it or not, it's worse than Savannah in that there is not that comfort and ease of interacting with each other at all. I mean, and it's very apparent when you are the person of color. And I definitely don't get that sensation in Savannah, but it could be that I'm still in my honeymoon phase and everything's like, woohoo, I'm home, this is great, But I do recognize from an economic standpoint that and that's what we're talking about, is like, how do we move towards social justice and economic justice? And to me, it's going through the reconciliation process, going through the healing process, and then you touch base on it, is basically saying, and then taking some action. And that to me is where I think the rubber leaves the road. I think there's some people that will engage in taking an action, and some people that just, don't want to go there. And that's on both sides of the fence. So Joe, as we kind of continue to wind into our time, is there anything else that you would like to share for your parting remarks?
Only to say that, not only is it an honor to be on the show, but I very much appreciate the conversation that you're engendering among people, because if we're going to get to that next level of not only just acceptance, but to have a community that is more than just tolerant, that is truly celebrates the diversity, that we're going to have those conversations.
Right.
And some of the conversations to come are harder.
Exactly.
Because it involves people giving up their financial privilege.
Right.
And it doesn't mean necessarily that you're giving up the opportunity to succeed, but you're giving up the opportunity to have that leg up. And that's hard for people. You might say, hey, is it okay to have a African American newscaster on your show tonight? Of course. Is it okay for your kids to play together? Of course. Is it okay for you to give up some money? Well, maybe not.
Right.
And so, it's a little tougher discussion.
And it is, and I think it that also comes to play in what I'm seeing among the African Americans in Savannah. There is, it's a little bit different in how it's playing out in that world, and it's more of a class system that I'm seeing here among African Americans. But I'll get into that at a later show. And Joe, on that note, I have an open door policy here with the guests. So at some point in the future, I hope you'll be back on the show and share some more insights as we continue to go through this reconciliation journey.
Love to do it and keep fighting the good fight.
Great. Thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye. As we continue with the One Human Nation show, thanks again to Joe for being on the show and sharing his insight about reconciliation, and it is and about race, and realizing that it is a tough conversation, and everyone's journey is different. Everyone's every path is different, but the important part, I believe, is that we have to start. We have to start taking that walk. We have to, and that doesn't mean that we sometimes don't stumble. So I will share this story with you as I get ready to wrap up for this hour. And this happened to me recently in Savannah, and I call it, a missed opportunity. There was something I was participating in, and I'm not going to mention names or anything. And there was something there that bothered me. And it was with an institution that I kind of felt like they should know better, and what is that for? And I should have asked the question while I was there, and I didn't. And it was something that was, shocking to me, and the person that was with, who was also a person of color. And we kind of looked at each other and then kind of walked away. We talked about it later, because of course we were interested in what we were there to do, which is no justification. I'm saying that to say this, that even though I try to walk in this walk of being intentional about calling out racism when you see it, or at least asking the questions in a non-confrontational way, there is still that hesitation. And of course, I haven't let it go. I'm still kind of working through, okay, how do I get back around to that? And it may require me taking another course so I can still see if it's still there. But all of that to say that there are no experts in this journey. There are people that study the psychology. There are people that study the sociology. I highly recommend that you take a look at the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Because I am going to be talking about that in more detail as we continue to work through this show. And because this is from a psychologist, and she really gets into some tough questions, especially how she had the conversation with her kids when they were asked things, and in school, and what questions that what explanations that she gave them, because part of child development, you've got to meet kids where they are. Well, you have to meet everybody where they are, but in thinking that, well, I'm not going to address the conversation, that doesn't mean that your children are not noticing. And so we do need to have the conversation. So one of the things that I would like for you to reflect on, especially if you invest in the book, and you can even do that by getting it, I assume, out of the library. She talks about, and this is on page 94, so just so you know, she talks about developing your white identity as well as black identity. And one of the things that she points out, and this is for whites, that there are two major developmental tasks in the process of identity. And one is the abandonment of individual racism, and then the other is the recognition of and opposition to institutional and cultural racism. And then she goes on to say what stages, the 6 stages that process is, and how you have to work through that if you're on the side of the fence that's white. And I am going to be going to the other side of the fence also, just so you guys know, in case you're wondering, oh, Sandy, she's just picking on the white people. That's not true. Everybody's going to have a day on the One Human Nation show, because it's all about our journey, our history, and for us to have a very serious conversation about it. Once again, thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show. We invite you to tune in on Thursdays, 107.5 FM. Or you can stream directly from the station by going to WRUU.org. So I want to just explain, you don't have to pull down a special application to stream. You just go directly to WRUU.org, and you'll see an icon where it's showing what's playing at the station, and you just kind of click on that little arrow right there, and you should be able to tune in and listen to WRUU.org. Once again, thanks for listening, and as we prepare for the top of the hour with Sound Limit with Troy Stoner, thanks for listening to the One Human Nation show.